But anyway, look, thanks everybody for joining us. Just to say finally that the talk itself will be recorded on Zoom, and if anybody's any issue with that, just to come back to us. And then, as I say, just to introduce Dr. Lauren herself. So, as we mentioned, she is the historian here at Clifton House, where she spends most of her days researching the history of the place, of Mary Ann, of the society, of the people who lived here, or at least she tells me that. And she also then has her own sort of specialist area, which is really around child poverty in 19th century Belfast, and how charitable institutions, particularly Belfast Charitable Society, worked with and tried to improve the lives and the welfare of those children during this period. Lauren started here a few years ago as a student on a part-time associate, as did James. And she then was so drawn to the place and the history of the place that she decided to do her PhD on Mary Ann, but we have now lured her back in full time.
I Lauren, say more accurately, I came running back.
You came back, thank you very much for that. The fibers in the post. Well, look, we'll hand over to Lauren, and then, as I say, pick up with any questions at the end. So enjoy. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Good. Thank you very much, Paula, for that lovely introduction, and thank you everyone for coming along this evening to hear a wee bit more about the women of Clifton Street Cemetery, who I think hopefully many of you haven't heard before, or you might know a couple of ones. So the aim of tonight's talk was to broaden your knowledge of the women of Clifton Street Cemetery. So let's move. Oh no, the keyboard doesn't want to be
one or the other.
Great start. Oh, here we go. It's starting to work. Excellent. So our talk begins in late 18th century Belfast, which is a time in which Belfast was a lot more rural than it is today. So basically we had the poorhouse and we had our own farm at the back, which is a very little known fact. It was a lot smaller in terms of its population, with around 13,000 in 1780. It was during this period, and particularly as Belfast entered the Victorian period, that we see the gender ideology of the doctrine of separate spheres beginning to play out. So this stated that men and women were different and were meant for different things. Men were physically strong, while women were termed as weak. Men were seen as independent, while women were dependent. Men belonged in the public sphere, while women belonged in the private sphere and the home. Men were meant to participate in politics and in paid work, while women were meant to run households and raise families. Women were also thought to be more naturally more religious and morally finer than men, who could be easily led astray. I just find this in the dictionary, do not quote me. This concept of domestic spheres continued from the 18th century until more recent times. And a consequence of this cultural phenomenon is that we see women being either referred to in history as simply as the wife, sister, or niece of an important male individual, or they're not written at all in history. And in my talk today, I would like to share with you some of the stories that myself and my intern from Queen's University, Bernadette, have unearthed about the women of Clifton Street Cemetery. There we go. So who better to start this talk with than with our very own Mary Ann McCracken? And indeed, it is not possible to talk about the history of Belfast in the early half of the 19th century without mentioning this remarkable woman. Mary Ann was born in Belfast on the 8th of July 1770. Her father was John McCracken, who was a wealthy sea merchant and who owned his own ropeworks business. Her mother was called Anne Joy, and her family had long established roots here in Belfast, with Mary Ann's grandfather being Francis Joy, the founder of the Belfast Newsletter, and her great-great-grandfather was the former sovereign of Belfast called George Martin. And together, Captain McCracken and Anne had 7 children. So we had Robert, who sadly passed away in infancy. We had Mary Ann's older sister, Margaret. We had Francis, who was commonly known as Frank. William, and everyone knows Henry Joy, or Mary Ann called her Harry. Mary Ann herself, and last but not least, John. Mary Ann and her siblings grew up in the centre of Belfast, and it was said that the McCracken siblings could see the mast of their father's ship when he was moored on High Street. Her father and mother were very liberal-minded and had the foresight to educate all their children on equal terms, regardless of their gender. Girls' education in the 18th century was very different from boys. Usually female education would have involved embroidery, sewing, dancing, as well as very basic reading, writing, and counting. However, Marianne, thanks to her liberal and progressive parents, was given the opportunity to go to David Manson's school on Donegal Street, and David Manson's just the figure on the left there. The school day began at 7 a.m. and the children were divided into two companies based upon the grades of society, including kings, queens, tenants, and subtenants. The grades were given out based on the amount of material the children could learn and memorise. Manson's methods were very way ahead of the time, so it was choice rather than coercion, encouragement rather than ridicule, achievement and recognition without the discipline of the rod, were all hallmarks of his method. It was in this very forward-thinking environment that Marianne received her academic education. Her mother Anne taught her all that she needed to know regarding domestic and craft work. She learned French too, due to her father's efforts in finding an old maid who could speak French. And Marianne herself had a great admiration for the English writer Mary Wollstonecraft. Marianne's emphasis on forthrightedness and energy, as opposed to rather insipid feminine charms, which were very vogue at this time, might have come straight from the pages from the Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was written in 1792. Marianne certainly wasn't the only young woman to have read these works, including things like Wollstonecraft, Rousseau, or Paine, but she went far beyond the theory, far more than any of her contemporaries, and translated them on a reality, on a day-to-day basis. Wollstonecraft's hope was for a future in which women might certainly study the art of healing and be physicians as well as nurses. They might also study politics, business of various kinds, if they were educated in a more orderly manner. Well, Marianne seems to have been the very embodiment of this aspiration of Mary Wollstonecraft. We'll just move that up a little bit so we can actually see the. There we go. So Marianne lived in some of the most turbulent times in Belfast history, including the 1798 Irish Rebellion, and was a firm supporter of the United Irishmen. The United Irishmen wanted to see a democratic change in Ireland, believing that this could heal the religious divisions that had harmed the country. They promised to unite Catholic, Anglican, and Presbyterians, and they wanted to advocate for free trade and the end to the penal laws, which hindered, for example, how Presbyterians and Roman Catholics couldn't stand for election or had any rights to vote. Frustration was growing within the burgeoning middle classes, who wanted a fairer, more representative parliamentary system. The volunteers looked to the consequences of the American War of Independence and the French Revolution of 1789, which brought them hope that there was an alternative way to govern. Marianne inhabited the same cultural spaces as other people who supported the United Irishmen. There were even separate female societies for those who supported the United Irishmen, which had been in existence since at least October 1796. However, Marianne did not approve of these female societies, though it was for much more liberated reasons. She argued that women should be allowed admission into the main societies, and I quote from Marianne, as there can be no other reason for having them separate but for keeping women in the dark. Yet, as the male leaders were being imprisoned and arrested, Marianne and other women had to increasingly fill in the gaps that the men had originally fulfilled, which included the concealment of firearms. And in March 1797, when Henry Joy was arrested and imprisoned in Kilmainham jail, Marianne wrote to Henry Joy to assure him that the gun that used to be housed in their house had been given to a man who could be trusted, and he had buried it into the country. And these women were involved in the concealment of firearms right throughout the country. After the failure of the 1798 Battle of Antrim, Henry Joy went into hiding, but Marianne knew that he was hiding in Antrim Hills and set off to find him with Roseanne, who was her brother William's wife. This was an exceptionally dangerous undertaking, with people being shot, slashed, and imprisoned for breaking the curfew, never mind aiding and abetting a criminal. Against all odds, they were able to track him down after several days walking, and Henry was amazed and delighted to see them both. Marianne was able to give him money, food, clothing, as well as able to secure him a ship to take him off to America. But he was unfortunately captured before his voyage and was later put on trial. Marianne worked furiously and tirelessly in an effort to have his court-martial dismissed or have the evidence skewed in her brother's favour, but to no avail. And when Henry Joy was being accompanied to the scaffold, Marianne accompanied him, and she told Dr. Madden in a later letter and recalled the events of that day. And she stated that she'd not weep until Henry was actually on the scaffold and she had to be taken away. Even after Henry Joy's execution, she employed a doctor to try and resuscitate Harry, but he was ultimately buried later that night in McCrackenthorpe at the parish church on High Street. But following his execution, Marianne was told of Harry's illegitimate daughter, Maria, in which there was much stigma attached to children born out of wedlock. But Marianne was a strong and independent woman, and the young girl called Maria was brought back to Rosemary Lane to be raised by her. Her brother John wrote to another sibling, and I quote, "We have got an addition to the family since you were here. It is a little girl, said to the door of poor Harry's, but brought very much against my inclinations." Marianne was left to mourn the loss of her beloved brother, but Maria gave her a renewed sense of meaning in life, and Marianne threw herself into humanitarian and political causes, one of which was the poorhouse, which her uncles helped to finance, design, and build. So the Belfast Poorhouse had a special place in Marianne's heart, and her mother took her to visit the institution since she was a young girl at the age of 6. Indeed, most of Marianne's family were connected with the Belfast Poorhouse in some way. Her uncles Henry and Robert Joy designed and found the funds to build the poorhouse, and her father and some of her brothers sat on the boards of the Belfast Charitable Society. So although the Ladies' Committee was not informed until 1827, Marianne was making her presence felt much earlier. For example, in 1819, Marianne argued with the Gentlemen's Committee so that a teenage girl called Ellen Murray could remain in the poorhouse as she had no other means of supporting herself, and her mother was quite sickly at home. And it just shows how Marianne fought many wars of attrition with the Gentlemen's Committee and usually got her own way. The Ladies' Committee was eventually set up in 1827, following a meeting of various Belfast women, which was chaired by the social reforming Quaker Elizabeth Fry. She encouraged the women to get more involved in Belfast charities, and this resulted in the formation of the Ladies' Committee in 1827. In their initial minute books, it was recorded that the ladies, and I quote, beg most earnestly to assure them, i.e. the gentlemen, that there shall be no interference whatsoever with any of their managements or regulations. And I always like to think Marianne and the Ladies' Committee had their fingers crossed behind their backs when they wrote that statement. Indeed, Marianne and the Ladies' Committee worked hard to ensure that the children of the poorhouse had the best start in life. She, along with the other ladies, helped to ensure that all the children were well educated and even helped to establish an infant school in the poorhouse, despite the Gentlemen's Committee denying her previous 2 requests. She ensured that the children apprenticed out in Belfast and the surrounding area were putting on trial to make sure they got along with their master and mistress. The Ladies' Committee checked on them 3 or 4 times a year, and Marianne refused to allow any of the girls to go into anything cotton or linen mills because it was very injurious to their health. Marianne and the Ladies' Committee were a stickler for hygiene and ensured there was always plenty of soap to keep the children and their clothes clean. The Ladies' Committee also offered practical recommendations to the gentlemen to improve childcare in the poorhouse. So this included giving the children sweet milk rather than buttermilk, as the acid in the buttermilk upset their stomachs. And as you can see from this side, it wasn't just the poorhouse that Marianne was involved with. She was sort of involved with everyone, everything and everything. And we always like to think Clifton House that if you were near Marianne long enough, she would find you a committee for you to be on, or she would start a whole entire committee for you to get involved with. So it was a little known fact that Marianne and her sister Margaret had owned their own muslin business on Warren Street, near their brother Francis's establishment. The 2 sisters were typically known as kept ladies, which meant that they were provided for by their brothers or their father. However, it's a testament to the sisters that they established their own business in an age where employment for opportunities for women were very slim. And Marianne remarked that she wanted to earn some money so she could do what she pleased, which sort of meant typically giving it to those who were in need. The sisters' business did relatively well, but like most businesses, they did face difficult times. And when faced with debt and bankruptcy, Marianne could not put her workers out of work or of a job, even when it directly impacted on her own life. And I quote from Marianne, "I could not think of dismissing our workers because nobody would give them any other employment." Marianne was just very good to her workers. And a fragmentary notice in the Belfast newsletter reference a labour dispute and at times they praised the McCracken sisters for their treatment of their workers. And in an anonymous letter to the newsletter, Marianne advised the factory owners of ways in which to improve health and well-being of their workers, from provision of soap to clean the workers and whitewashing walls. But once again, her love of children shines through. She states that children are the responsibility of the employer, who should offer them premiums for good behaviour. And she closes the letter, and I quote, "In short, the proprietor of the factory is in duty bound to consider himself as the parent of a numerous family, and to do all those things which a sensible and virtuous parent would do." So Marianne, as always, and I always like to think Marianne, if she was alive today, would be a good trade union person. So Marianne was a lifelong abolitionist and was an original member and later president of the Belfast Ladies Anti-Slavery Association. The Belfast Newsletter on the 29th of September 1846 reported that a group of women in Belfast were inspired by the visit of Frederick Douglass and set up an anti-slavery association later that year. Its purpose was to render the situation of the slave more generally understood and to inspire others to stand with the abolitionist movement. The Belfast Ladies Anti-Slavery Association was well versed on the laws of the United States and were deeply averse to those who forbid people of free colour or slave from preaching or learning to read and write. The association invited people to contribute items to be sent and sold in America to raise funds. Marianne also practiced what she preached by abstaining from eating sugar, which was a byproduct of the slave trades and the West Indies plantations. Indeed, many of her abolitionist views can be found in the letters to the historian Dr. Madden. In one letter written in 1859, Marianne wrote about the earlier movement for abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire, which was supported with enthusiasm by many in Belfast, and she recalls that Thomas Russell was one of a number of people alongside herself, and I quote, "abstained from the use of the slave labour produce until slavery in the West Indies was abolished, and at the dinner plates to which he found so often invited, and confectionery was so much used, he would not taste anything with sugar in it. I am both ashamed and sorry to think that Belfast has so far degenerated in regard to the anti-slavery cause." And in the same period, Marianne wrote that America, considered to be the land of the great, the brave, may more properly be styled as the land of the tyrant and the slave. Belfast was once so celebrated for its love of liberty, is now so sunk in the love of filthy liquor, that there are but 16 or 17 female anti-slavery advocates for the good cause of paying 2 shillings and 6 pence yearly, but not one man, though several Quakers in Belfast, and none to distribute papers to American immigrants, but an old woman within the 17 days of her 9th birthday. This is the prevailing image of Marianne, as a lone abolitionist standing on the docks, continued to campaign for the abolition of slavery at the age of 88. Indeed, Marianne lived just long enough to see President Lincoln freeing the slaves in America in 1863. So Marianne passed away peacefully on the 26th of July, 1866. She had completely outlived her generation, and for a woman who marked the graves of the United Irishmen, there was none to mark hers. In 1902, the bones that were supposedly meant to be the bones of Henry John McCracken were taken from the old parish graveyard in High Street by Francis Joseph Bigger, who kept these bones, as you do, in a glass jar in his front parlour as part of his 1798 museum. So anyone who was anyone at the time came to view them, including Patrick Pearse and Roger Casement. And eventually in 1909, probably out of a bit of peer pressure, he laid the remains in a small coffer and marked Marianne's grave with a headstone, which you can see here on the screen. The Gaelic inscription translates as "faithful or true until death," referencing her devotion to her brother. But here at Clifton House, where Marianne championed the women and children for most of her life, we like to think she was faithful to the people of Belfast until death. So from a couple of graves down from Marianne, we have a woman called Martha McTeer. So Martha McTeer was born in 1742 and was the eldest of 3 surviving daughters or children of the Reverend Thomas Drennan, who was a Belfast Presbyterian minister, and his wife, Anne Lennox, who was the daughter of a wealthy Belfast merchant. However, unlike Mary Ann, there's nothing known about Martha's youth or her education. In 1773, she married Samuel McTeer, who was a Belfast candler and a widower, and was a member of the Belfast Charitable Society. Their marriage was a happy one in spite of constant financial security. Samuel went bankrupt in about 1781, but in 1885 he was appointed as the ballast master of the Belfast harbour, and he consequently began a business as a public notary. From about 1768 to 1789, the McTeers lived at Cabin Hill, a house that Samuel built at home and created a small farm in County Down near Belfast. However, due to the stresses of financial security and her sister's declining mental health, this all took its toll on Martha McTeer, and she suffered a nervous breakdown in 1789. So Martha appears to have inherited both her father's intellect and her mother's lively personality. And in 1776, she began the remarkable correspondence of her brother, William Drennan, who is a noted United Irishman, physician, and poet, for which she is chiefly remembered for. So Martha, like her brother and Mary Ann McCracken, was a firm supporter of the United Irishmen, and both sides of the Drennan-McTeer correspondence have survived, spanning over 40 years, and they provide a unique window into life in Ireland during the latter half of the 18th century. And I think there's like something like 14 or 1,400 letters from both William and Martha still surviving, over 3 volumes, which you can purchase today. You can. So the political content of these letters makes them a leading source for the study of Irish politics in the 1790s, but there are a few aspects of 18th century life that they do not cover. Martha discussed everything from what she read, her love of the theatre, to political meetings and charity sermons she attended. She mentions fashion, furniture, servants, money, and debt. For example, in one letter she wrote to her sister-in-law, who was the wife of William Drennan: "Dear Sarah, as you say you have a few shillings of mine in your hand, I send you a fan and think, as it is handsome but a bit too large, it may be more fashionable in size, for I am so far a fashionist, as perceives that the wearing of any large fan was a ridiculous effect. And if there's anything happening in Belfast, I always like to think Martha knew about it and wrote it in her letters. Martha knew everything, so she did." So Martha was approached in 1793 by a committee of women to become the secretary of the new Humane Female Society for the Relief of Lying-in Women, which founded the first lying-in hospital in Belfast. Its patroness was Lady Donegal, and the vice patroness was Lady Harriet Skeffington. So the leadership was very much drawn from the upper classes, but likely that the 145 members were drawn from the middle classes. And this majority of a middle class composition is why Martha McTeer was drawn as the executive secretary. So the ladies first petitioned the Belfast Charitable Society for rooms in the poorhouse, because the poorhouse had its first infirmary. And because William Drennan was the physician of the poorhouse, it sort of just made sense to Martha to have it quite close to her brother and his medical knowledge. However, her petition was denied because there was just no room to have a lying-in hospital in the poorhouse. The committee then rented a house on Donegal Street, where Picari Bakery is today, which had room for 6 lying-in women. However, this was far too small, and a bigger hospital was eventually built in 1830 in Clifton Street, on land rented by the Belfast Charitable Society, and the Society also gave them free access to fresh water and the use of Clifton Street Cemetery for those who sadly did not survive childbirth. So the Belfast Newsletter welcomed the Humane Female Society's plans as a scheme that does not honour to the heart that conceived it, and to all who are instrumental in bringing it to perfection. However, there was much controversy firstly of the lying-in hospital helping unmarried women have their children, but I would actually argue that it just shows how progressive or liberal these women were, especially with the stigma attached to single married women who were migrating into town just looking for work and a way to survive. So in 1794, Martha began her own independent school for a small number of young poor girls, with whom she collected an early hour and educated them at her home. The school came to the notice of the editors of the Belfast newsletter, who commended the scheme, noting that this mode of instruction is superior to that of most Sunday schools, which in towns too seldom have been found to answer their purpose. So not only did Martha McTeer teach the girls how to read, knit, and write, but she also encouraged their political education. And Martha wrote in her letters, "My girls do not gabble over the Testament only, nor read with that difficulty which prevents pleasure in it. I keep up my number, and 4 of them can read from Fox and Pitt." So they can. Oops. It's likely that Martha McTeer's small school provided the inspiration for a more ambitious undertaking in 1795. In March of that year, Martha McTeer and Lady Skeffington proposed a scheme for the education of poor girls. The planned Union School, which was on Union Street, was to be residential with food and clothing provided for the children. The aim was to prepare the girls for domestic service and other apprenticeships, and to teach them reading and every sort of needlework, with the wider objective being to protect innocence, to prevent vice, and to instruct ignorance. However, the proposal promoted a debate amongst the press. A letter to the Northern Star, signed "The Bucks," sarcastically proclaimed, "We love girls educated above their rank and their heads filled with ideas beyond their means. We by experience know the consequence. We shall always have fresh supplies for your excellent seminary." But in spite of this opposition voiced against the school, the Ladies' Society prevailed, and the Union School opened on the 23rd of May, 1795. 8 girls were initially admitted and taught how to read, knit, and spin, and the governesses continued to print notices on the school's progress to reassure their subscribers about their contributions had not been misapplied, and requesting the inhabitants of Belfast to send their extra needlework to the school for the girls to learn. Though the institution never became self-sufficient, by 1797 it was supporting 21 girls. And in 1795, her husband Samuel suddenly passed away. So although the McTeers' financial situation had improved in the 1790s, Martha McTeer now found herself poor because Samuel had died without actually leaving a valid will. So she and her stepdaughter Margaret set up a house together in Belfast, and Martha augmented a small payment from her wealthy cousin Martha Young, whose donation you can actually see in the donation boards of the Belfast Charitable Society, by taking charge of an orphan girl of good family as a paying guest. So Martha McTeer continued her charitable and school commitments until an old age, until she eventually lost her sight. Martha McTeer died on the 3rd of October 1837 and is buried in Clifton Street Cemetery in the Drennan McTeer plots. And in our records, she is simply recorded as McTeer, so it's actually very hard for us to actually know that is Martha, but because of the correspondence of the dates, we know that is exactly Martha. And they only gave her the occupation as a private lady, despite the remarkable things she accomplished in Belfast. And that's just where we think she's beside William Drennan, but beside the McTeers, but there's actually no inscription to say that's Martha McTeer. So you can literally pass Martha without actually realising she was buried there, which is very sad. So now we're going to move from the middle classes to the working and poor classes. So first we have Isabella Marshall. So she was one of the matrons of the Belfast poorhouse, and in which she would have been responsible for ensuring the poorhouse was kept clean and tidy, managing the domestic servants and washerwomen, and caring for the poor who occupied the building. In one report from the Belfast newsletter, we can see that Mrs. Marshall was involved with the annual Ben dinner Christmas celebrations in 1852. The newspaper reports that on Saturday, Christmas Day, the inmates of the old poorhouse, consisting of 58 old men, 86 old women, and 101 children, male and female, in all 245 were provided with an excellent dinner consisting of roast beef of the best description, and that's underlined, with bread and ale and plum pudding, and also with tea, bread in the evening. It was cheering to observe the contented, happy countenances of aged inmates, men and women, and the children were particularly clean and healthy looking. The exertions of Mr. Marshall and the steward of this establishment and of Mrs. Marshall were remarkably praiseworthy, and on the whole conducted with the most perfect order and regularity. So sadly, Isabella passed away in 1856 from heart disease, and she was buried in the Brodie plot in Clifton Street Cemetery. And the Belfast Charitable Society published on the 27th of November an obituary in her memory, which I thought was actually quite a nice read. And you can see it's our sad duty to record the death of our most excellent matron, Mrs. Marshall, in whom this committee had always found a careful and efficient officer, this institution an excellent matron, and the inmates a kind and attentive friend. And they later replaced Isabella Marshall with her sister because of her own good character. So just when we're coming to the end of our talk today, I wanted to highlight some of the stories of the poorhouse women who were buried in the Poor's Ground of Clifton Street Cemetery. So first we have Nancy Rice, who was admitted into the poorhouse in 1817 as her father passed away and her mother did not have the means to actually look after her. So while she was in the institution, Nancy was provided with a clean set of clothes, was well cared for, and was educated so she could make a living for herself as an adult. So like other charitable institutions during this period, the 3 hours, reading, writing, and arithmetic, were taught to the poorhouse children, as well as religious education and appropriate moral behaviour. To girls such as Nancy Rice, who have been taught basic domestic skills such as knitting, sewing, and cleaning, with a future role as in the domestic sphere. However, the Belfast Charitable Society was very much innovative in the type of education they provided the children. Mary Ann herself reported that some of the children, and particularly the girls, were taught French. The boys were being sent off into the Navy to be taught navigational skills, and music was taught to all. And this highlights how the Belfast Charitable Society used education to prepare children for their future apprenticeships, as well as shaping them to become respectable and industrious citizens. So when a child had been adequately educated, they would have been apprenticed off, normally when they're around the age of 12, to further their vocational training and learn the skills of a particular trade. So boys would have been apprenticed to a variety of trades, including weaving or working in the foundries, while girls would have been bound to those in the domestic sphere, such as domestic service. But interestingly, Nancy Rice remained in the poorhouse to help with the care of the younger children in the nursery and help the school mistress, Mrs. Gilpin, in the girls' school. This highlights how the Belfast Charitable Society saw Nancy's talent lay elsewhere in caring for some of the youngest children in the poorhouse. So Nancy temporarily left the poorhouse between April 1834 to August 1836, as she accompanied Mrs. Gilpin to England because she was ill, and looked after her until she passed away in 1833. But when Nancy returned, she continued her role in caring for the poorhouse children and was allowed, on recommendation of Mary Ann and the Ladies' Committee, to attend the Brown Street Infant School to learn about childcare and to be a teacher there. And eventually Nancy Rice came back to the poorhouse to become the infant school teacher. So Nancy would have been responsible for caring for the children, from getting them up in the morning to making sure they were kept clean and tidy, which I'm sure was very hard to do, as well as nursing them back to health whilst they were sick, as well as providing them an education.
I think we need Nancy tonight for the sound of out there. Need the ghost of Nancy.
So on the 2nd of February 1847, Mary Ann reported that no business came before the ladies today, as the children were preparing to attend the funeral of Nancy Rice, who died of ill health on Sunday morning. And in the burial records, it states that Nancy had actually died away from inflammation in her chest and was only 42 when she passed away, so was quite young for the time. And Mary Ann recorded that Nancy was much beloved, being kind, affectionate, and considerate towards the poorhouse children. And despite the sad end, the life of Nancy Rice reveals how the Belfast Charitable Society helped her at various stages of her life, providing her with education to eventually training her and subsequently employing her to care for the younger children in the poorhouse. And without the help of the Charitable Society, Nancy and many others like her would have remained impoverished, as they would have not had the education or vocational training to find employment and therefore the means to lift themselves out of poverty. So the last lady who I would like to bring your attention to is a lady called Margaret Gallagher, who was admitted into the poorhouse in 1838 at the ripe old age of 99. And she was formerly a shopkeeper, but from the records, it appears that Margaret Gallagher, despite her old age, was quite the character in the poorhouse. So after entering the institution, she was sentenced to confinement for 3 months for emptying a chamber pot from her window. Margaret was also confined on 3 occasions for drunkenness. Her offence from April 1836 was recorded in the orderly book as follows. The affairs of the house was conducted in the usual manner. However, 2 female inmates, Morrison and Gallagher, came in last Sabbath, the worst from spirits. And this is all I can really find about Margaret Gallagher, but she sadly passed away at the old age of 103 in 1840 and was buried in the prayer ground of the prayers ground at Clifton Street Cemetery. So this brings me to the end of my talk, and I hope you all learned something about the women who are buried in Clifton Street Cemetery. So I'm happy to take any questions.